Hi, everyone. This is the recording for Friday, April 23rd, and concludes the long section on agriculture, human resources, and employment in Latin America. So I am going to start sharing my screen and pick up here, labor markets and employment. On Wednesday, briefly at the very end, I just mentioned that employment is one of the most serious challenges to economic development in Latin America. And I also said that is obviously tied to agriculture because migration from rural to urban areas is making impossible to absorb, to give formal employment to all of these people coming from ag. And also is tied to education because the new forces produced by globalization are requiring a very skilled labor force that is in many cases multilingual, ready to travel, open to understanding new cultures, in addition to the skills, highly technical skills. So the educational sector, as we saw, unfortunately has been failing in Latin America and therefore is falling behind in terms of providing the skill force that the new world requires. Another important element to consider, and this is something that I didn't mention yet, is that if you remember when Latin America in the 1990s replace the ISI strategy with the more open model, export-led type of policies, there was a shift from producing for domestic consumption only, captive market, to a model where production has to meet domestic consumption, but also international trade. So the Latin American economies moved from a very independent, self-consumption, non-tradable type of economy to a highly competitive, tradable types of goods and services to be sold internationally. Now, this implies a movement from non-tradable sectors to tradable sectors, right? Now, the transition in Latin America has been extremely difficult because the skills in the non-tradable sector, I'm talking about things like, cutting hair, really things that don't require a lot of skills, particularly because you are not going to be exporting these goods or services to a type of production model where you need all these skills and abilities. This has not been possible because skills are not easy to transfer across sectors. Let me give you an example. In the US, in 1994, when NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, was passed, the federal government enacted through Congress, the US Congress, they passed the Workforce Investment Act of 1994, WIA, Workforce Investment Act of 1994. And the idea of the federal government in the US was that they knew that many businesses were going to be moving south, taking advantage of the cheap labor in Mexico. And therefore, many people in manufacturing were going to lose their jobs because they would have to move from manufacturing that was shrinking to other sectors in the economy. But in many cases, they didn't have the skills that can be employed in these other sectors. So what the act did was to provide the funding at the federal level to different localities. And I believe at the time the condition was a given population, a given city was supposed to be at least 100,000 people to receive this type of assistance for upgrading of skills, training, they help you to put your resume together, to find a job, all of these things, many other things through the Workforce Investment Act, to help people transition from one sector to the other, to move from the contracting sector, manufacturing in this case, to other sectors in the economy, which could be services or other sectors in the US economy. So the idea was to help workers transition. In Latin America, they didn't have that. They didn't have that. The transition from ISI to export promotion led had no support from the federal government in terms of helping workers transition from the non-tradable to the tradable sector. And that made it even more difficult to absorb all these workers that were losing their job in the contracting non-tradable sector in the tradable sector, because they didn't have the skills and they didn't have the means to learn or to upgrade or to retrain, nothing like that, right? So again, I'm just trying to give you a sense of why the informal economy in Latin America is so big. A combination of migration from rural areas, the poor educational system, and the inability to absorb in the formal sector this massive amount of uneducated people. So a few comments about labor markets. Job creation has been really, really slow in Latin America. I'm talking about formal jobs. The informal jobs have been growing very quickly, because think about this. You have a family of 2 or 3, you're faced with a situation where you cannot go back to your community because, well, there is nothing to do there, or you sold the land, you sold the farm, you have to make it in the city or else. Well, obviously you don't have the education that you need to be employed in modern companies or factories. You are not an engineer, you're not an accountant, you are not a marketing person, you're just a regular person, probably with a middle school degree. What are you gonna do? Well, you create your own job. You become a street performer, a food performer, I'm sorry, a street vendor, or a street performer. Informal economy, right? And you create this because you don't need to comply with many regulations. You don't need permission from anybody. You don't need to apply for a permit. And you don't need a lot of capital too. Certainly, it's not going to give you much, but it's better than nothing. It's better than nothing. The other element is that the supply of workers, fortunately, is slowing down, because fertility rates in Latin America are going lower and lower. So 40, 30 years ago, the average number of children was 3, 4. Right now is between 1 and 2 in Latin America. So the size of the families is shrinking because the fertility rates are going down, and therefore the supply of workers is also in decline, which is in a way good news, because at least we don't have to fight these natural forces of population growth in terms of providing employment for all of these people. Unemployment rates, as I said, have not fallen. And this number of 10% is actually a underestimate, because if you consider all these people in the underground economy, although they are working, they are not part of the formal labor market, right? So more likely, if you were able to count everybody that is not part of the formal labor market, this number is going to be way, way higher, which is what I'm trying to capture in number 4. The informal employment has significantly increased. And again, I am only talking about estimates of extra legal businesses, what Hernando de Soto called extra business. Extra legal entities. People that, again, are selling food, clothes, shoes, tools on the street, or that they are performing, throwing fire, juggling at the corner of the street, shoe shining, all of these things that are really not illegal, other than not paying taxes and obviously not following any codes. But at least we're not. I'm not talking about the other illegal activities like narco trafficking, organ trafficking, human trafficking, prostitution, all of these things that are clearly illegal. That is a whole different story, and well, we can talk about that. Right now, I'm just talking about the informal, extra-legal activities in Latin America. In fact, Hernando de Soto, in addition to this very famous book that I already mentioned, it's called The Mystery of Capital, he wrote another book, which is called The Other Path. In Peru, in the 1980s, there was a very nasty terrorist group called the Shining Path. They were used to bomb shopping malls and anyway, a very, very radical group. And the claim was that the Shining Path was born as a response to the crescent pressure and the inability for many people to make it in the legal world because they didn't have the tools. So they actually took the weapons and started protesting and became very radicalized. But anyway, in this book, the second book of Hernando de Soto, which is called The Other Path, Hernando de Soto describes these alternative ways for people to survive. And this is the idea of the other path, not the Shining Path, the terrorist group, but the other one. That is what, again, he qualifies as the extra legal. They are not within the law, but they are not really outside the law. And of course, this was a bestseller, a very interesting, at the time, a very interesting collection of stories and arguments that are very well known now and very well documented in the empirical literature, right? Anyway, as I was talking about before, the difference between tradable and non-tradable, employment rates have increased in the non-tradable goods sectors, which is good. Public employment have fallen or has fallen. The reason is that with the impetus on neoliberal policies, on more reliance on markets and less reliance on governments, privatization, all of these things obviously are reducing the size of local, state, and federal governments. And of course, they are becoming more efficient too. So the number of people employed for the government is in decline, which again, I think it's probably a good sign. Recovery of wages, here is the problem. Average wages have been going up. So if you look at increases in productivity, they're going up, and they are matched by increases in the wage rate. And that is a really good thing for all Latin American countries. The problem, once again, is that, and this is why I always recommend to students in ECON, that you always take the average measurements with a grain of salt, that you dig deeper. What's behind the average? What's driving, for example, in this case, the upward trend? Why? Well, because the average typically, or at least in many cases, can mask significant disparities. In the particular case of Latin America, speaking about wages going up on average, the masking is taking place on what we call wage differentials between high skill and low skill workers. This chart that you have here on the screen, let me do this. All right. This chart is measuring the wage differential. Now, what is this wage differential? And this is time. This is from my doctoral dissertation, right? So I still use this because, you know, I began interested in these things way back then when I started in the PhD program. So notice all the way to throughout the 80s, you have more or less an stable relationship between the wage rates of the top 10% and the bottom 10%. The top 10% represent high-skilled workers, college degree and higher, scientists, engineers, accountants, economists, right? Attorneys, doctors. And the top 10% of the population represents low skill. In the case of Latin America, people with less than high school degrees, right? Farmers, we can call them technicians, although they have no degrees, people working in mechanic shops, really, really low skills type of people. But then look what happens starting in the 80s. You see this increasing trend. Now, what you have here, the wage differential is the ratio between the top 10 to the bottom 10. Starting in the 80s, late 80s perhaps, or mid 80s, you have this increase in the differential, meaning that those at the top 10% start making more money, relatively speaking, with those at the bottom 10%. So the point is that over time, you see this increase in the gap between those making a lot of money and those making a lot less money. This is important, guys, because this trend is not unique to Latin America. This is happening all over the world. In some cases, like Latin America, this trend is more pronounced, is more dramatic than others. But this is actually happening in the US. When you think about automation, robotization, all this new technology that is displacing unskilled labor in favor of skilled labor. In the old days, thinking about manufacturing, you had a factory where you had, 20, 30 workers with a screwdriver doing this, 8 hours a day. That was their job, labor intensive. Now you have a robot that can do the job of these 20, 30 people that they are going to lose their job because the skill level is not really that much. All you need to do is, to do this. But now you need an engineer to maintain, service, operate the machinery, right? So think about this. Technology can destroy jobs and can create new jobs. It destroys 20, 30 unskilled jobs and creates one job for the engineer or the technician that is capable of using and operating the machine. So, this is the creative destruction power of technology. It destroys and it also creates. But typically, when it comes to the labor market, it is destroying more jobs than the one is creating. And the problem is that in the process, we can see that the disparity is widening. Obviously, you have a lot more unskilled people that make less money, being unemployed, and a lot more people like engineers, skilled people, being employed, making more. And that's happening all over the world. In Latin America, like I said, this is more pronounced and more dramatic, but not unique. So this is the point. We have what some people call a global glut of unskilled workers. Think about this. Places like Africa, where the poverty level is very high, the level of education is very low, the human capital in general, education and health is very low, people tend to have a lot of children. Latin America, like I said, is reducing the fertility rates, but just very recently, in the recent past, Latin America was in a way relatively similar to Africa, where large families were the norm. and obviously feeding, educating all of this high number of children was very difficult. So the point is that, roughly speaking, the global labor force, you can think of this of two kinds. Highly skilled workers, and this is what I'm inviting you, all of you guys, to be right now in this. This is your chance to become a member of this group. It's an elite group that in general have the following characteristics: well-educated, strong marketable skills, linked by a common global culture, multilingual, mobile, and obviously scarce. You know, you need to know about computers, you need to know how to write, how to communicate, not just in English, but hopefully in more than one language, right? In the US, we're kind of lucky because the English has become kind of lingua franca around the world. But believe me, when you make the effort to speak another language with another people that is not from the US or they don't speak English, they appreciate that. And also, it kind of breaks some cultural barriers, makes you look good, right? Now, the second pool is the one that is having a rough time, the low-skilled workers, because these guys in general are poorly educated, not very skilled. They are tied to their local culture language. You know, they don't understand how to do business in Japan or in China, or how in Asia is different from doing business in Latin America, right? let me tell you this quick story. When I was in college, one professor, business professor, brought this brochure from a bank, a Mexican bank, that was the business of the bank was to promote international trade. So that the major customer base of the bank were exporting companies. So the bank was printing and distributing brochures of how to make business around the world. You know, if you are going to be transacting with a company in Japan, it's going to be very different if you do the same thing with a company in Peru or in Canada or in Germany, because there are cultural elements in terms of doing business. So, and I remember this very interesting one that it's still part of my my recollection of the language of the brochure. In the US, the brochure read, in the US, you close a business operation and then you go to a bar to celebrate. Now, that's different from the way typically business happen in Mexico. And that was the distinction that the brochure wanted to make. So in the US, you close the deal with a tie in an office, and then you go to a bar to celebrate. In Mexico, you close the deal at the bar. You know, after you've had a couple of beers or more, you become friends, and then you close the deal. So differences like that about respect, about timing, about colors, about the way you should be able to dress, to address people, all of these things. Well, low-skilled workers, they don't understand these things. They are less mobile, and obviously, here's the key: abundant. Abundant because we have lots of them. How do I? Let me see. Well, anyway, abundant here. Let me highlight this, and scarce here. So, since we're talking about the market, and you want the value of that thing to go up, for that thing to go up, in this case, labor, it has to be scarce. Because if you have lots of those workers, they are going to get cheaper, right? So anyway, I think you hopefully you get the idea. Now, here is again the argument of this global globe. Two forces. Technology, once again, is making machines increasingly capable of doing what humans used to do. Therefore, we can displace unskilled labor. And the second force is that poorer nations like in Latin America are producing lots and lots and lots of low-skilled workers. In less numbers, fortunately, than, again, 20, 30 years ago. But still, when you have 2, 3 kids that are going to grow in this environment in Latin America, where they are not going to be very well educated, they're going to be very tied to the local culture, not multilingual, well, and a lot of them, that is going to put them in the second group. So the point is that when you have a reduced demand for unskilled workers and an increased supply of unskilled workers, you have a glut of unskilled workers. And that has been one of the most important challenges in Latin America, because how do you employ hundreds of thousands of people that are not employable? You get the idea? Why would you hire a person with a high school degree or less to become the manager of your company? You don't do that. We don't do that, right? Or even if, well, I don't want to go that far, but I think you get the point. I think you get the point. Yep. Anyway, let me finish with this this section. This lecture is going to be short, and that's okay. There is a group of people that, speaking about migration, because migration is a big deal, particularly international migration for us in the US, because we're the recipients of a large number of them, particularly from Latin America, Mexico, and Central America. There is a group of scholars that have addressed something called the migration hump. So let me explain this. This I don't want to spend too much time on this. It's just something that I want you to be aware of in case you ever, come across with this. So there are 3 elements to consider in this migration hump effect: integration, migration, and development. So the idea is that the hump, like a camel, I'm gonna, you can see the picture, okay, actually here. The hump implies the following. And it has been shown in some papers that at early stages of economic development and at early stages of integration to the global economy, you don't have a large number of people leaving your country. They are waiting, they are trying to learn what's going on, they are trying to integrate themselves to the economy. But as the economy starts integrating into the global economy and hopefully developing, there are going to be people that are going to suffer. And then they are going to start thinking, okay, my opportunity here is gone. So what you have is this migration hump effect, where as economic development increases and as integration to the global economy increase, the number of people leaving your country is going to start increasing. Now, presumably, and this is what the analysts are proposing, is that this is just a temporary effect, that the people migrating, leaving your country because of poor economic conditions, lack of opportunities, and all of these things is just temporary. That eventually, once the process of integration and once the process of economic development consolidates, once it's on firmer ground, more solid, and so forth, this out-migration is supposed to decline and hopefully actually reverse, so that people actually start coming back to your country. Now, I produced this chart for, at the time, he was my boss in 1999. I was working and living in Venezuela. And this guy was going to give a presentation. And I mentioned about migration. So I mentioned the migration hump, and he said, hey, can you put something together for me? Sure. So the conference was about addressing the Andean region in Latin America, 5 countries: Bolivia, Ecuador, Colombia, Peru, and Venezuela. These are the 5 countries in the Andean region because of the Andes, right? And this guy, Fidel Jaramillo, my boss, said, and also I would like you to place these 5 countries in what more or less makes sense in terms of the migration hub. So at the time, Bolivia and Ecuador, I'm talking about, again, late 1990s, right? A whole different world, not what we have now in 2021. Venezuela was doing really well. Well, certainly, let's put it well, relative to other Andean countries. So Venezuela was placed at a high level of economic development, even better than Peru and Colombia, right? And Bolivia and Ecuador were behind. Right now, Venezuela, probably, I would put Venezuela, I don't know, probably right here, where the people living in Venezuela is huge. You have the rich Venezuelan people, because of the dire economic conditions right now, the rich people are moving to places like Miami and Houston and New York, or they go to Europe. But the poor people that cannot live far, they just cross the border to Colombia or other neighbor countries, right? Anyway, the point is that the migration hub is a sort of an interesting idea. I honestly have a significant amount of trust that this is actually something that we should be that we should consider as how things actually happen, because the case of Venezuela, for example, that used to be really, really good, in less than 20 years went south. So maybe what it was considered a consolidated economic development process was just an illusion. Or maybe it's because, they never achieved that, or many other factors. The point is that although I am talking about the migration hump, it's just a theoretical construct. It's a model. It's a model. And my point is that although I put 5 countries in 1999, and they were used for a real presentation in Venezuela, I have no evidence today that I could use something similar with Latin American countries. Or if I could, maybe I will have to change it again in 5 years, and 10 years later I'll have to change it again. So it's not really something that we could use to make predictions or forecasts or anything. That's the point. So it's an interesting intellectual exercise, but as a tool for analysis and for forecasting, for modeling purposes, is just not what it used to be. Like other tools, right? Like other things that are more solid. Anyway, the last section deals again with remittances. We already talked about remittances. In fact, I don't even remember why I have this section here. So I'm going to stop. I know it's a shorter than usual class, but that's okay. We are approaching the end of the semester, and well, we have covered a lot of ground. I know you have a significant amount of material already to study, to get ready for the exam. You have your paper, you have other classes, and you have lives too, family and other events happening. So that's totally fine. I'm going to stop now, and I will see you guys live again on Monday. So I'm going to stop recording now. Ciao, everyone.